The man at the gate looked straight at me, glanced at the original deed in my hand, and calmly told me that I was standing on private property that did not belong to me. Those words stayed with me long after the engine of my pickup truck fell silent. My name is Nathan Brooks. I am 41 years old, and until that morning I believed inheriting 1,100 acres from my late grandfather would be the beginning of a quiet new chapter in my life. Instead, it became the moment I discovered how easily history can disappear when enough years pass and enough people stop asking questions. The drive had taken nearly 6 hours across familiar highways that slowly gave way to rolling hills, old oak trees, and open country I remembered from childhood. Every mile brought back another memory of summers spent riding beside my grandfather Henry Brooks, learning how to repair fences, identify boundary markers, and respect land that had supported our family for generations. He always said that land remembered everything, even when people did not. At the time, I thought he was simply speaking like an old rancher. I did not realize those words would someday become the center of my own life. As I reached the address listed in the probate documents, I slowed my truck and frowned. The gravel road I remembered had disappeared beneath fresh asphalt. Decorative stone walls lined both sides of the entrance. Carefully trimmed hedges framed a large monument displaying the words Cedar Ridge Estates in polished bronze letters. Beyond the security gate stretched quiet residential streets filled with expensive homes, manicured lawns, and ornamental trees planted with mathematical precision. For several seconds I wondered if my navigation system had made a mistake. I checked the address again. I checked the deed again. Everything matched. This was supposed to be my grandfather's ranch. Instead, an entire suburban neighborhood stood where open pasture once stretched to the horizon. I pulled toward the visitor lane until a uniformed security guard stepped out of a small booth carrying a digital tablet. He greeted me politely and asked which resident I planned to visit. I answered, just as politely, "I am here because I own this property." His smile faded into polite confusion. I handed him the original recorded deed inside the worn leather folder that had belonged to my grandfather. He studied it for a few moments before shaking his head. "Sir, this neighborhood has been here for years." I nodded slowly. That does not answer what I said. Before either of us spoke again, another vehicle approached from inside the neighborhood. A white luxury sport utility vehicle stopped near the gate, and a woman stepped out wearing a navy blazer and carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems before breakfast. She introduced herself as Diane Foster, president of the Homeowners Association. She smiled courteously, looked at the deed in my hands, then back at me without the slightest sign of concern. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. "This community has existed for decades." I returned her smile because I could already feel something much larger hiding beneath those words. "Then perhaps," I answered, holding the deed a little higher. "The misunderstanding has existed for decades as well." Neither of us raised our voices. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the entrance while oak trees swayed beyond the rooftops exactly where I remembered them standing as a child. The land had not moved. The hills had not changed. Only the story people believed about them had changed, and standing there outside a gate built on my family's history, I realized I had not driven 6 hours to reclaim a ranch. I had come to uncover how an entire community had forgotten who owned the ground beneath its foundations. I did not argue with Diane Foster that afternoon because experience had taught me something valuable during years of working as a civil engineer. Whenever reality and paperwork seemed to disagree, emotions only made the truth harder to find. I thanked the security guard for his time, returned the original deed to the worn leather folder, and drove away without another word. In the rearview mirror, the entrance monument slowly disappeared behind rows of maple trees, but the feeling stayed with me. The neighborhood looked permanent. The homes looked permanent. Even the carefully paved streets looked as though they had always belonged there. Yet I could not shake the memory of galloping across those same hills behind my grandfather Henry Brooks, while morning fog still rested above the tall grass. I remembered fences stretching for miles, weathered cattle guards, shallow creeks reflecting the sunrise, and the familiar sound of the old windmill turning steadily with every passing breeze. My grandfather never measured the ranch by acres alone. He measured it by seasons. Spring meant repairing fences before the cattle moved. Summer meant checking water tanks beneath the blazing sun. Autumn brought long evenings beneath the oak trees while leaves drifted across open pasture. Winter meant walking the property lines together because he believed every landowner should know every corner of the ground beneath his boots. As a boy, I never questioned why he insisted on showing me rusted iron survey monuments buried beside old fence posts. He would brush away dirt with his hands and tell me, "Buildings come and go. Roads change. Trees fall. These markers tell the truth long after memories begin to fade." At the time, I cared more about fishing in the creek than listening to property law. Looking back, I realized he had been preparing me without saying so directly. Life eventually carried me away from the ranch. I studied engineering, built a career designing transportation projects across several states, and visited my grandfather whenever work allowed. He never complained that I chose a different path. Instead, every visit ended the same way. We climbed onto the porch as evenings settled across the fields, and he pointed toward the western ridge where the oak trees stood against the setting sun. "Promise me one thing," he said more than once. "Never let anyone convince you that time changes ownership." I always smiled and promised, believing the conversation belonged to another generation. After he passed away, probate became far more complicated than anyone expected because several distant relatives disputed portions of the estate before eventually withdrawing their claims. Nearly 4 years passed before everything was legally settled and the ranch officially became mine. During those years, I assumed the property had remained exactly as my grandfather left it. I paid little attention beyond reviewing occasional tax notices forwarded by the estate attorney. Nothing suggested that an entire residential community had appeared across the land. Sitting alone that evening in a small roadside motel less than 20 miles from the ranch, I spread the original deed, probate documents, and county tax statements across the bed. Every legal description matched perfectly. Parcel numbers remained unchanged. Acreage remained unchanged. Ownership remained unchanged. Yet somewhere between those pages and the entrance gate I had visited that afternoon, reality had separated into two completely different stories. One existed inside official records. The other existed in the minds of hundreds of people living comfortably inside Cedar Ridge Estates. I stared through the motel window as darkness settled across the countryside, and for the first time I understood that I was not facing a disagreement with one homeowners association president. I was standing at the beginning of a mystery that had quietly grown for decades while everyone, including me, assumed someone else had already verified the truth. I returned to Cedar Ridge Estates the following morning just after 9 o'clock, when the neighborhood was settling into its weekday rhythm. Parents had already driven their children to school, landscapers guided riding mowers across perfectly trimmed lawns, and delivery trucks moved quietly along streets that had once been open pasture. Nothing about the community looked careless or temporary. If anything, it reflected years of planning and steady investment that made what I had discovered even more difficult to understand. I parked outside the Homeowners Association office instead of approaching the security gate again. The building itself resembled a small professional business center with stone walls, large windows, and neatly maintained flower beds. Diane Foster greeted me in the lobby before I reached the reception desk. She appeared, neither defensive nor irritated. Instead, she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who genuinely believed the situation could be explained with a simple conversation. She invited me into a conference room overlooking a neighborhood park where children would probably be playing later that afternoon. Coffee sat waiting on the polished wooden table alongside several folders containing community documents. "I appreciate you coming back," she said. "I have spent some time reviewing what happened yesterday." I placed my grandfather's leather folder on the table, but did not open it. "Then perhaps we can both understand how two completely different versions of the same property exist." Diane nodded politely before sliding several maps across the table. They showed subdivision layouts, utility systems, road alignments, landscaped common areas, and dozens of residential lots. Every page looked professionally prepared. "This community has existed for over 20 years, she explained. "Families have purchased homes legally, taxes have been paid, infrastructure has been maintained, and county agencies approved every stage of development." I carefully examined each drawing before looking back at her. "I do not doubt any of that," I replied. "What I am trying to find is the document transferring ownership of the original ranch." For the first time, she paused before answering. Ownership, she repeated. The development records speak for themselves. I slowly opened my leather folder and placed the original deed beside her subdivision plans. Development approval is not the same thing as ownership. Roads can be approved. Utilities can be approved. Construction can be approved. None of those automatically transfer title. Diane remained composed, although I noticed her eyes return to the deed several times. Surely, she said, if there had been a problem, someone would have discovered it years ago. I understood why she believed that. Most people trust that official processes automatically verify everything placed before them. As an engineer, I knew reality was often more complicated. Systems usually function well until one overlooked assumption quietly becomes the foundation for every decision that follows. I asked only one question. Can you show me the recorded deed where my family transferred ownership of the ranch? The room became noticeably quieter. Diane opened another folder and reviewed several pages before setting them aside. She searched a second folder, then a third. Finally, she looked back at me with the same professional composure. But this time uncertainty had replaced confidence. I do not have that document here, she admitted. Perhaps the county maintains it. I nodded because that answer confirmed exactly what I had begun to suspect. She had not challenged my deed. She had simply assumed another document existed somewhere beyond her files. As I left the office, I glanced across the neighborhood one more time. Residents walked their dogs along sidewalks built where cattle trails had once crossed the hills. Decorative ponds reflected the morning sun where seasonal creeks used to overflow each spring. Everything appeared settled and unquestioned. Yet beneath every driveway, every mailbox, and every carefully planted tree lay a single question that nobody seemed able to answer. If ownership had truly changed, where was the one document that should have been impossible to lose? I left the Homeowners Association office with one conclusion that refused to leave my mind. Diane Foster had shown me years of development plans, maintenance records, architectural approvals, and community guidelines, yet not one document answered the single question that mattered most. Who had legally transferred ownership of the land? By noon, I was walking through the front doors of the county recorder's office, carrying my grandfather's leather folder under one arm and a notebook filled with parcel numbers under the other. The building smelled faintly of old paper, polished floors, and fresh coffee, a familiar combination that reminded me of engineering permit offices I had visited throughout my career. A clerk greeted me with a friendly smile and asked what records I needed. I handed her the parcel information from the deed and explained that I wanted the complete chain of title dating back as far as the archives allowed. She typed quietly for several minutes before raising her eyebrows. That is an unusual request, she said. Most people only search the last transaction. I smiled politely. Today I need every transaction. Nearly an hour later, she returned with a stack of certified copies covering decades of recorded history. I spread the documents across one of the public research tables and began reading each page in chronological order. Every transfer before my grandfather made perfect sense. Every legal description matched. Every signature had been properly recorded. Then the documents simply stopped. The final recorded owner remained Henry Brooks, followed by the probate transfer placing the property in my name. There was nothing in between. No sale, no donation, no court order, no condemnation, no subdivision deed, no recorded conveyance of any kind. Assuming I had overlooked something, I requested additional records from the planning department located in another county building. The planners produced impressive binders containing zoning changes, environmental reviews, roadway approvals, drainage studies, and utility coordination dating back more than 20 years. The level of detail was remarkable. Every street had been carefully engineered. Every retention pond had been calculated. Every sidewalk location had been reviewed. Yet as I turned page after page, I noticed the same missing piece. The files explained how the neighborhood had been designed, but they never explained how the developer acquired the land in the first place. Curious, I visited the county tax assessor's office next. Their digital maps displayed the same parcel boundaries listed in my grandfather's deed. Property taxes had continued to be assessed under the original ranch parcel for years before later being divided into residential lots. The assessment history was complete, but once again the ownership history contained the same unexplained gap. By late afternoon, I found myself inside the Geographic Information Systems department, where an analyst helped me compare aerial photographs taken over several decades. We watched the landscape change year by year on a large computer screen. First came open pasture and scattered oak trees. Then survey flags appeared. Construction equipment followed. Roads slowly emerged across the hills. Houses multiplied one phase at a time until the modern neighborhood filled nearly every corner of the former ranch. The physical transformation was easy to see. The legal transition remained invisible. Before leaving, I thanked the analyst for her time. She hesitated before speaking. "You know," she said quietly, "I have worked here for almost 15 years. I have never noticed that missing deed." Her words echoed in my mind as I walked into the fading afternoon sunlight. For different county offices had independently confirmed thousands of pages of accurate records. They documented engineering, zoning, taxation, mapping, and construction with extraordinary precision. Yet somehow the one document that should have existed before any of those processes ever began remained completely absent. For the second time in 2 days, I found myself staring at a mystery that was becoming harder to dismiss as a simple clerical mistake. The silence inside the official records was beginning to sound louder than any document I had found. I spent most of the next morning following memories instead of maps. The official records had answered one question by refusing to answer another, and something my grandfather used to say kept returning to me. Whenever a courthouse file seemed incomplete, he would tap the brim of his old hat and grin. "Always check the ranch before you believe the office." At the time I assumed he meant broken fences or wandering cattle. Now I wondered if he had meant something much larger. The original ranch house still stood several miles beyond the neighborhood on a section of land untouched by development. It had been vacant since his passing, protected only by a locked gate and years of silence. As I unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of aged cedar, leather, and dust greeted me like an old friend. Sunlight filtered through the western windows exactly as I remembered, illuminating faded family photographs, a stone fireplace, and the heavy oak table where my grandfather had balanced countless maps over morning. Coffee. Time had settled over every room without disturbing anything important. I walked slowly through the house, opening cabinets, desk drawers, and filing shelves that I had already reviewed during probate. Everything appeared exactly as I remembered. Then my eyes stopped on an old cedar chest sitting beneath the staircase. I had seen it hundreds of times growing up, but I had always believed it contained blankets and winter clothes. The brass lock had already been unlocked, and inside I found folded quilts covering several weathered document tubes tied with faded leather straps. My pulse quickened as I carefully lifted them onto the dining table. Inside the first tube rested original survey drawings prepared decades earlier, their heavy paper still remarkably preserved. Each carried official surveyor seals and handwritten notes identifying iron monuments, fence corners, creek crossings, and oak trees that served as historical reference points. Every measurement matched the legal description recorded in my deed. The second tube contained utility easement agreements signed many years before the subdivision ever appeared. They granted limited access for power lines and underground services across specific portions of the ranch, while clearly stating that ownership of the land remained unchanged. My grandfather had underlined one sentence in blue ink. Easement rights do not convey title ownership. Beneath those documents lay a thick envelope labeled simply, "Read this if anyone ever questions the ranch." My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. The letter inside was dated nearly 15 years earlier. He explained that several developers had approached him over the years hoping to purchase portions of the property, but every negotiation ended without an agreement because he refused to divide land that had remained in the Brooks family for generations. One paragraph immediately caught my attention. He wrote that survey crews had occasionally requested permission to enter neighboring areas while preparing conceptual plans, and he had allowed temporary access only after receiving written assurances that no ownership rights were being transferred. Attached behind the letter were copies of those signed permissions. They authorized surveying activity for limited periods, but repeated the same condition over and over. Temporary access shall not be interpreted as conveyance, dedication, transfer, or sale of any portion of the property. I sat quietly for several minutes as afternoon light drifted across the old table. Suddenly, the missing piece became easier to understand. My grandfather had anticipated that confusion could someday arise, and instead of relying solely on county files, he had preserved every supporting document inside the ranch itself. He had not hidden them out of secrecy. He had protected them out of patience, believing that one day someone might need to separate assumptions from facts. As I carefully returned every paper to its protective sleeve, I realized I was no longer searching for evidence that my family owned the land. I already had that. What I was beginning to uncover was something far more remarkable. An entire neighborhood had likely been built upon a chain of assumptions that everyone accepted because no one had ever gone back to read the original story. I knew the next step could not rely on memories or handwritten letters alone. Everything I had discovered needed to stand beside modern evidence that any engineer, attorney, judge, or surveyor could independently verify. The following morning, I contacted Kevin Marshall, a licensed land surveyor whose reputation for precision was known throughout the county. After reviewing copies of my grandfather's original surveys, he agreed to meet me at the ranch before sunrise. The air was cool as we loaded survey equipment into a utility vehicle and headed toward the first iron monument identified on a drawing prepared more than 60 years earlier. Kevin studied the faded coordinates before walking several yards through tall grass. Within minutes, his metal detector produced a clear signal beneath the soil. We carefully brushed away layers of dirt until the top of an iron survey pin emerged exactly where the original documents indicated it should be. Kevin smiled without saying much. Surveyors are not easily surprised, but I could tell he appreciated what we had just found. Throughout the day, we repeated the same process again and again. Another monument appeared beside an old oak tree that had somehow survived decades of development. A third marker rested near the edge of a seasonal creek whose winding path still matched the original field notes almost perfectly. Every recovered monument aligned with the bearings and distances recorded by my grandfather's surveyors. By afternoon, Kevin transferred the measurements into specialized mapping software and overlaid them onto the county geographic information system. I watched as colored boundary lines gradually settled into place across a large monitor inside his office. Modern satellite imagery blended with historical surveys, subdivision plats, utility easements, and parcel descriptions. One layer after another appeared until the complete picture stood before us. The roads inside Cedar Ridge Estates crossed the same property lines established generations earlier. Neighborhood entrances occupied former ranch access points. Decorative ponds had been constructed where natural drainage channels once flowed. Even the landscaped common areas followed old pasture boundaries with remarkable accuracy. Nothing about the physical location contradicted my grandfather's records. In fact, every new measurement reinforced them. Kevin leaned back in his chair and folded his arms while studying the screen. From a surveying standpoint, he said carefully, these original boundary monuments control the legal description unless something officially replaced them. I already knew what my next question would be. Have you found any evidence that they were officially replaced? He slowly shook his head. No. If there had been a recorded boundary adjustment, vacation, or conveyance, I would expect supporting documentation. So far, I have not seen any. Before leaving, Kevin prepared a preliminary report documenting every recovered monument, every verified coordinate, and every comparison between historical and current mapping. The report contained photographs, measurements, diagrams, and references to the county records I had already collected. It was objective, technical, and free from opinion. That was exactly what I needed. As the sun began dropping toward the western ridge, I drove back toward the ranch instead of returning directly to town. I stopped beside the same weathered oak tree where my grandfather had once shown me an iron marker hidden beneath fallen leaves. Standing there again, I finally understood why he insisted that permanent monuments mattered more than temporary appearances. Neighborhoods could expand. Roads could be widened. Landscapes could be redesigned. Even memories could fade over time. Yet the original lines placed into the earth decades earlier still pointed silently to the same conclusion. The evidence was no longer resting inside one leather folder or one cedar chest. It now existed across certified surveys, digital mapping systems, physical monuments, and official public records that all agreed with one another. For the first time since arriving at the property, I felt something stronger than uncertainty. The land itself had begun telling the same story my grandfather had tried to preserve, and every new piece of verified evidence made that story more difficult for anyone to ignore. I resisted every temptation to rush toward a courtroom because I knew that confidence without preparation often became the fastest path to failure. Instead, I called Laura Bennett, a real estate attorney whose practice focused on land title disputes and property records. When I arrived at her office carrying my grandfather's leather folder, Kevin Marshall's survey report, certified county records, and the documents from the cedar chest, she did not begin by asking what outcome I wanted. She simply asked me to place everything on the conference table in the order I had discovered it. For nearly 3 hours we reviewed every page without interruption. She compared survey dates with subdivision approvals, probate filings with tax assessments, and easement agreements with planning documents. Occasionally, she made handwritten notes in the margin of a legal pad, but for the most part, she remained completely silent. Finally, she leaned back and looked directly at me. "Your evidence is unusually consistent," she said. "That does not automatically determine the outcome, but it gives us a clear place to begin." Rather than preparing accusations, Laura focused on building a complete historical timeline. We started with my great-grandfather's ownership records, continued through each recorded transfer within the Brooks family, documented my grandfather's decision to reject purchase offers from developers, included every easement agreement preserved inside the ranch house, and finished with the probate order transferring ownership to me. Beside that timeline, we assembled a second chronology containing every public action taken by county agencies during the construction of Cedar Ridge Estates. Planning approvals, environmental reviews, road permits, drainage studies, utility installations, subdivision plats, tax assessments, and occupancy records all fit neatly into sequence. The more organized the timeline became, the more obvious one empty space appeared. Every significant event rested upon a legal transfer of ownership that no one could locate. Laura explained that courts often appreciate facts presented in chronological order because timelines remove unnecessary emotion and allow documents to speak for themselves. That became our guiding principle. Kevin refined his survey exhibits until historical boundary markers aligned perfectly with current aerial photography. I organized certified copies from every county office into indexed binders with labeled tabs so each record could be located within seconds. Even my grandfather's handwritten letter was carefully authenticated by matching signatures already contained in older recorded documents. Nothing would be included unless it could withstand careful examination. Several days later, Laura contacted Diane Foster before any formal legal filing occurred. She explained that new evidence had been assembled and invited the Homeowners Association to review the documentation voluntarily before the dispute advanced further. Diane responded professionally and agreed to receive copies through the association's attorney. There were no angry exchanges, no public accusations, and no dramatic confrontations. Everyone involved understood that complicated property questions deserved careful review rather than emotional debate. As the days passed, additional requests for records began arriving from attorneys representing the Homeowners Association, the original developer, and the title company connected with the neighborhood's construction many years earlier. Instead of feeling discouraged, I recognized that as an encouraging sign. People were finally searching for the same missing document that had puzzled me from the beginning. One afternoon, Laura placed a clean legal binder on the conference table and closed the cover with quiet satisfaction. Inside were indexed exhibits, certified records, survey reports, historical photographs, easement agreements, probate documents, tax histories, and a complete chain of title extending back through multiple generations. Nothing inside depended upon assumptions. Every page pointed to an identifiable source. As I carried the binder out to my truck, I realized that my grandfather had been right all along. Patience was not the opposite of action. Sometimes patience was the most important action of all. We were no longer trying to prove an emotional argument about fairness or tradition. We were preparing to let decades of carefully preserved evidence explain exactly what had happened, one verified document at a time. The hearing began on a quiet Tuesday morning beneath the steady rhythm of fluorescent lights and the soft turning of legal files. There were no dramatic entrances and no raised voices, only attorneys, surveyors, county officials, and representatives from Cedar Ridge Estates taking their places with the understanding that every answer given that day would become part of the public record. I sat beside Laura Bennett with my grandfather's leather folder resting inside our evidence box, no longer because we needed it to prove ownership, but because it had started this entire journey. Across the room, Diane Foster acknowledged me with a respectful nod. She no longer carried the certainty I had first seen at the neighborhood gate. Instead, she appeared thoughtful, almost curious, as though she also wanted to understand how so many years of accepted history had reached this point. The proceedings began with routine procedural matters before Laura presented our timeline exactly as we had prepared it. She did not begin with emotion or family stories. She began with recorded ownership dating back through multiple generations of the Brooks family. One certified deed followed another until the probate order transferred the property into my name. Kevin Marshall then explained his survey findings with the calm precision I had come to admire. Large exhibits displayed historical boundary monuments alongside modern satellite imagery. Every recovered marker corresponded with the original legal descriptions. Every measurement independently confirmed the same property boundaries. The judge asked several technical questions regarding survey methodology, and Kevin answered each one by referencing accepted surveying standards rather than personal opinion. When county representatives testified, they confirmed that planning approvals, zoning actions, roadway permits, drainage reviews, and infrastructure inspections had all been properly processed according to the information submitted at the time. Their testimony established that government agencies had approved development procedures, not ownership itself. That distinction became increasingly important as the morning continued. Laura then presented the easement agreements discovered inside the cedar chest. The language appeared on a large display visible throughout the courtroom. Temporary access shall not be interpreted as conveyance, dedication, transfer, or sale of any portion of the property. The sentence was simple, but it directly addressed assumptions that had quietly accumulated over many years. Finally, the discussion returned to the question that had followed me since the first morning at the security gate. Laura addressed the courtroom with remarkable simplicity. Can anyone produce a recorded document transferring ownership of this property from Henry Brooks or his heirs? The courtroom remained completely still. Attorneys representing the Homeowners Association submitted subdivision records, planning approvals, title insurance materials, engineering plans, and tax documentation. Representatives connected with the original development explained the historical process as thoroughly as they could. Yet despite every effort, the one document everyone expected to exist never appeared. The judge requested additional time to review every exhibit before returning later that afternoon with carefully written findings. He explained that the court was not deciding whether families had acted in good faith when purchasing their homes. The evidence suggested that many had. Instead, the court had been asked to determine whether legal ownership had ever been transferred through a properly recorded instrument. After reviewing the complete chain of title, certified public records, historical surveys, physical boundary monuments, probate filings, and every document introduced during the hearing, the answer remained unchanged. No recorded conveyance transferring ownership from the Brooks family had been produced. The silence that followed those words felt different from every silence I had experienced during the previous weeks. This one was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with clarity. The missing document had not been overlooked inside another filing cabinet or hidden beneath another stack of records. After decades of searching through history, the truth was remarkably straightforward. The record did not contain it because, according to every piece of verified evidence presented before the court, that transfer had never taken place. The months that followed were filled with far more paperwork than celebration, but I had expected that from the very beginning. Legal ownership had been clarified, yet everyone involved understood that hundreds of families had built their lives believing the records presented to them years earlier were complete. The court encouraged every party to work toward practical solutions instead of unnecessary conflict, and that became the path we followed. Laura Bennett coordinated with attorneys representing the Homeowners Association, local officials, lenders, and title professionals to establish a framework that respected both the verified ownership history and the reality of an established community. Diane Foster attended every meeting. The confidence I had first encountered at the entrance gate had gradually transformed into something I respected even more. She stopped defending assumptions and started helping solve problems. During one meeting, she quietly admitted, "I spent years believing I understood the history of this neighborhood. I never realized I had inherited questions instead of answers." I appreciated her honesty because I knew she had not created the situation. She had simply trusted records that everyone else believed were complete. Kevin Marshall continued refining the official surveys until every parcel, easement, roadway, and utility corridor matched the corrected legal descriptions. County offices updated mapping databases, recording indexes, and property files so future generations would never encounter the same uncertainty again. Watching those revisions take place reminded me that history is not rewritten through speeches. It is corrected one document at a time. Several residents eventually approached me while I visited different parts of the property. Instead of arguments, most conversations began with curiosity. They wanted to understand how something so fundamental could remain unnoticed for so many years. I always answered the same way. Systems are built by people, and sometimes people unknowingly repeat an assumption until it begins to resemble a fact. That does not mean anyone acted with bad intentions. It simply means the original question was never asked carefully enough. One cool autumn afternoon, I returned alone to the western ridge where my grandfather and I had stood countless evenings watching the sun settle behind the oak trees. The neighborhood below looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Families walked their dogs through landscape parks. The same breeze moved across the hills just as it had decades earlier when there were only fences, pasture, and open sky. The land itself seemed completely indifferent to the legal journey that had unfolded around it. It had simply waited for someone to listen carefully enough to understand its story. I reached the weathered survey monument beneath the old oak tree and brushed away a few fallen leaves exactly as my grandfather had taught me when I was a boy. The iron marker remained firmly in place, unchanged by passing years, new roads, or changing memories. I finally understood why he had insisted on showing me those forgotten corners of the ranch instead of only its most beautiful views. Boundaries were not about keeping people apart. They were about preserving truth when memories eventually faded. As the evening light stretched across the hills, I looked toward Cedar Ridge Estates one final time. I did not see strangers living on my family's land anymore. I saw neighbors who deserved accurate records just as much as I deserved an accurate history. Justice had never required humiliation, revenge, or triumph over other people. It had required patience, careful listening, and the willingness to let verified facts speak louder than long-accepted assumptions. I slipped my grandfather's leather folder beneath my arm and started walking back toward the ranch house. The documents inside had finally completed the story he began protecting years before. His greatest inheritance had never been 1,100 acres. It had been the quiet lesson that truth does not become stronger because it is louder. It becomes stronger because, no matter how much time passes, it remains exactly where it has always been, waiting for someone willing to uncover it with honesty, respect, and patience.